On Christmas morning, while I was standing by the window making coffee, my daughter walked up to me with her familiar sweet smile. She placed a thin folder in front of me, tied with a red ribbon, and spoke softly. "This is your gift, Dad. You just need to sign it before the new year, and that's it." I looked down. It wasn't a card. It wasn't an investment contract. It was $400,000 of her husband's debt, given a very pleasant name, family responsibility. I didn't ask questions. I didn't object. I signed. The brief flash of relief in their eyes told me everything I needed to know. Then it was my turn to give a gift, a small box, carefully wrapped. When my daughter lifted the lid, her scream tore through the room where Christmas music was playing, because what was inside wasn't money. It wasn't a gift. It was the truth, the thing the two of them had tried to hide from me for 3 years. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. That morning began just like every other Christmas morning in this house. The fireplace was still warm from the night before. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples lingered in the air. Outside the window, snow covered the garden, bare maple trees standing motionless like silent witnesses. The old Christmas song I play every year, the warm, slow baritone voice, drifted from the small speaker on the kitchen shelf. If anyone had looked in, they would have thought this was a model American family. A retired father, a grown daughter, a successful son-in-law, gathered together in a spacious suburban home in Illinois. A picture so perfect that I once believed I was truly lucky. I believed that for 3 years. Regina stood across from me, wearing the cream-colored sweater I had bought her one winter long ago. She smiled, the same smile from her childhood, the smile that once made me believe that no matter how harsh the world outside might be, my daughter was the one thing I had done right in my life. Justin stood slightly behind her, holding a cup of coffee, trying to look calm, but I could clearly see his hand gripping the cup more tightly than necessary. The folder between us looked far too neat to contain something capable of destroying the life of a man nearly 70 years old. White paper, clear print, numbers lined up precisely as if they had been carefully prepared. $400,000, not a risky investment, not a business opportunity, but a debt waiting for someone else to carry it. Regina spoke very gently, very slowly, as if afraid she might startle me. She used words I had heard my entire life: family, responsibility, sacrifice. She said Justin was only going through a temporary rough patch, that the market wasn't favorable, that everything would be fine if I helped them get through this year. "You understand, Dad," she said, almost whispering. "You've always been the one who carries the family." For a very brief moment, as I looked at that number, I didn't see $400,000. I saw 3 years earlier, when Regina and Justin moved in with 2 suitcases and a promise that they would only stay a few months. I saw the dinners I cooked for the family, the utility bills I quietly paid, the times I told myself that family shouldn't be calculated like an expense. But in that same moment, another part of me, the part I had relied on for 42 years at work, spoke up. That part didn't listen to sweet words. It looked only at the numbers and asked who benefits and who pays the price. I didn't say any of that out loud, I just nodded. I picked up the pen, I signed. The moment the final stroke was finished, I saw Regina's eyes light up for a split second before she could hide it. Justin let out a very soft breath, like someone who had just placed a heavy burden onto someone else's shoulders. Just a moment. But for me, it was enough. I hadn't signed out of weakness. I signed because I needed to see the full, unmasked face of what was really happening. I stood up and walked toward the corner of the room where the Christmas tree stood, carefully decorated with old ornaments from many years ago. Some of the baubles had been hanging there since Regina was a child. Some of the ribbons had been chosen by my wife. Beneath the tree, among the colorful packages, was my small box. I brought it back to the table and placed it in front of Regina. "If it's Christmas," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me, "then I have a gift for you two as well." Regina smiled, the relieved smile of someone who believed everything was settled. She reached out and opened the box. The scream came almost instantly. High, sharp, ripping through the space that had been filled with familiar melodies. Justin dropped his coffee cup. The dark brown liquid spread across the wooden table, but no one noticed anymore. Inside the box, there was no money, no check, nothing they had been expecting. Only stacks of neatly arranged papers, printouts dense with numbers, dates, notes, dry, cold things, but precise. Regina's hands shook as she flipped the first page. I saw the color drain from her face. Justin stepped closer, read over his wife's shoulder, then took a step back as if he had just seen something that should not exist. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Once the truth is placed on the table, it needs no explanation. It carries its own weight. The room sank into silence. Only the Christmas music continued to play steadily, suddenly sounding out of place, as if it belonged to another world, the world I once believed was mine. I looked at them, the two people who had lived under this roof for 3 years, who had called me Dad, who had used my memories and sacrifices as leverage, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel lost. That Christmas morning, my house was still warm. The snow outside kept falling, but the one thing that truly changed was that I was no longer blind. And I knew that from that moment on, none of us could ever go back to the way things were. About 3 weeks before that Christmas morning, when everything was still intact, I had been standing at what I later realized was the final boundary between trust and clarity. It was an ordinary evening. No snow, no holiday music, just a cold December day, the kind of cold that seeps into old bones even when the heat is on. I had just carried a basket of laundry up from the basement when I heard Regina's voice coming from the bedroom on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar. Yellow light spilled into the hallway. I was about to keep walking when a sentence made me stop. Not because it was loud, but because of the tone. It wasn't the voice my daughter used with friends. It wasn't the voice she used with me. It was lower, more relaxed, with a hint of smugness I hadn't heard in a long time. A short, soft laugh, like someone who was very confident they were holding all the cards. "No, I'm serious," Regina said, dragging out the end of the sentence. "My dad is very predictable." I froze on the stairs, one hand still gripping the handle of the laundry basket, half my body already upstairs, the other half still on the landing. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but I couldn't move forward either. "He's always been like that," Regina continued, then laughed. "Always the one who takes responsibility. Always thinks that if he doesn't carry it, the family will fall apart." I heard someone respond on the other end of the line. I guessed it was a close friend. Regina laughed louder. The sound echoed down the hallway, bounced off the walls, and came back to me sounding so unfamiliar that I wondered if I had misunderstood. "Exactly," she said. "He'll never say no, especially if you say it the right way." I stood still, not because I was afraid to hear more, but because I wasn't sure how much more I could take. Regina kept talking, her voice growing more comfortable, less restrained. She spoke of me as if I were a habit, an assumption. There was no hesitation, no trace of guilt, only a cold certainty that I would do exactly what she expected. Then Justin's voice cut in. Not loud, but clear enough. He didn't say much, but each sentence was short and practical. "He's the last option," Justin said. "There's no other choice." The last option. I had heard that phrase countless times in my work over the decades. It was never used to describe a person. It was reserved for accounts, assets, resources, things to be used when everything else was exhausted. "Just get him to sign before the new year," Regina said, as if repeating a carefully calculated formula. "Once that's done, everything will be fine." Justin gave a quiet laugh. "Fine for us," he said. There was a brief pause. Then Regina lowered her voice, conspiratorial, as if sharing an amusing secret. "He owes us," she said. 3 years. 3 years we've been here. That has to be worth something." 3 years. I looked down at the laundry basket in my hands. Regina's sweaters, Justin's shirts, the bedsheets I had changed just the week before. All of it suddenly carried a different weight. No longer daily family life, but evidence of a calculation I had never been invited into. I didn't step up. I didn't step down. I stood there on the stairs, like someone who had just discovered that the house he lived in contained a hidden room everyone else knew about, except him. What left me frozen wasn't the number they mentioned. I had seen larger numbers my entire life. I had signed off on, examined, and rejected risks worth millions of dollars. Money didn't shock me. What took my breath away was the tone. The way Regina spoke about me, not as a father, but as a tool, something predictable, something that could be manipulated as long as you pressed the right keys. I quietly set the laundry basket down. The sound was soft, barely audible, but in my head it cracked like a fracture. I turned and walked back down the stairs, one step at a time. I didn't want them to hear me, not out of fear, but because I knew that if I walked into that room then, I would destroy something I still needed to see clearly. That night, I had dinner with them as usual. Regina talked about a job application that hadn't received a response. Justin complained about the market, about investors, about how everyone is struggling right now. I nodded. I listened. I didn't argue. To anyone watching, I was just an aging father, still willing to believe his daughter. But inside me, something was shifting, slowly, unmistakably. For the first time, I didn't believe what they were saying. I remembered it. I noticed how Regina avoided my eyes when money came up. I noticed how Justin always answered first, as if rehearsed. I noticed details I had previously ignored because I believed families shouldn't suspect each other. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was angry, not because I was sad, but because one question kept repeating in my mind, steady and cold, like a test I had used countless times in my career. If this weren't my daughter, if this were a case file, how would I evaluate it? The answer came quickly, and it wasn't pleasant. The next morning, I said nothing. The day after that, I still said nothing. I continued my routine. I made coffee. I read the paper. I asked Regina if she needed more milk from the fridge. I did everything a normal father would do. But inside, I had shifted from trusting to observing. I began listening not just to words, but to silences. I began looking not just at surfaces, but at what was carefully hidden. I wasn't searching for the truth in anger. I waited for it to reveal itself. Because if there was one thing I had learned after more than 40 years working with people who believed they controlled everything, it was this. When someone thinks they're holding the upper hand, they talk more than they should. And from the moment I stood on that staircase, I decided I would not confront them. Not yet. I would not expose them. Not yet. I would let them continue believing I was the predictable father they thought I was. And while they played their roles, I would watch, not as a father anymore, but as someone who knew all too well how the truth looks just before it can no longer be hidden. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat alone in the small study on the ground floor. A private room where I used to read the paper in the mornings and store old documents from my working years. The desk lamp cast a soft yellow light over the wooden surface darkened by time. Outside, the wind brushed against the bare branches, carrying the dry cold typical of a Midwestern winter. I didn't turn on any music. There was enough noise in my head already. 42 years. The number surfaced clearly as I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. 42 years in auditing and financial fraud investigation. 42 years of reading numbers that seemed lifeless but told very real stories about greed, deception, and the ways people justify their actions. I had met all kinds of people, successful executives, loyal employees, even fathers in other families. And so many of them, when exposed, shared the same sentence. I only did it for my family. Back when I was still working, I used to think that was one of the most dangerous justifications of all. I opened the right-hand drawer and took out the old black notebook. It wasn't a work journal, just a notebook I used for random notes after retirement. I placed it on the desk, opened the first blank page, and picked up a pen. An ordinary ballpoint pen, nothing special, but the feeling of holding it was strangely familiar. I didn't rush to write. My eyes moved around the room. On the wall hung the last certificate I received before retirement. Beside it was a photo of Regina and me on the day she graduated college. I remembered how tightly she hugged me that day, how she said she wouldn't have made it there without me. I had believed her with everything I had. 3 years living together. 3 years I told myself I was helping my daughter through a difficult period. 3 years I chose not to look too closely because I didn't want to see anything that might disappoint me. The new car in the garage surfaced in my mind, a sleek black SUV parked right next to my old sedan. I remembered the day Regina drove it home, smiling brightly, saying it was a great deal bought from a friend. I hadn't asked anything else. I just nodded. A few weeks later, at dinner, Regina said they were barely getting by, that they might have to sell some things if it didn't improve. I listened and felt worried, but I didn't connect the two things. Not then. Then the shopping bags. I had seen them, one by one. Thick paper, embossed logos. Once I noticed a large bag sitting at the corner of the stairs, then gone the next day. I explained it away. Gifts, discounts, sales. I was very good at explaining things to myself. I had never realized how good until now. The father in me wanted to believe that my daughter could never deceive me, that if something was wrong, it had to be because of circumstances, pressure, things beyond her control. That father raised Regina through sleepless nights, rushed meals, and savings trimmed down little by little. That father did not want to believe that all of it could be turned into a cold calculation. But the auditor in me was not that forgiving. He was trained to look at what didn't add up, to ask questions when the answers sounded too smooth, to never ignore a detail just because it was uncomfortable. Those two men were facing each other inside me, without speaking, but so clearly that it left me exhausted. I bent over and wrote the first line in the notebook. Not a conclusion, just a note. 3 years, living together. Then I continued. Living expenses, new car, shopping. Each line was a piece of the puzzle. No emotion, no judgment, just data. I wrote very slowly, as if afraid that if I rushed, I might accidentally add what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. I thought back to the scattered conversations over the past months. Regina complaining about how hard it was to find a job. Justin talking about projects that hadn't worked out. Each story sounded reasonable on its own, but placed side by side, next to what I had already seen, they began to tilt out of alignment. I stopped writing and leaned back in the chair. The questions surfaced clearly, impossible to avoid. If this weren't my daughter, if this were a file placed on my desk 10 years ago, how would I evaluate it? I had done that hundreds of times, receiving a stack of documents, skimming them, then reading carefully, then starting to ask questions, not out of personal suspicion, but professional responsibility. The answer came faster than I wanted it to. And it wasn't pleasant. If this were a work file, I would mark it high risk. I would request more information. I would not sign anything until I fully understood the entire picture. And I would be especially cautious of explanations that relied too heavily on emotion. I didn't like that answer, but I couldn't deny it. I bent down and kept writing. This time, more specific. Dates. Small details I had previously ignored because I thought they didn't matter. I wasn't looking for evidence to accuse anyone. I was simply doing what I had done my entire life, collecting. There was something very strange about applying my own professional skills to my private life, as if I were standing outside, looking at another family instead of my own. It made me feel both cold and clear-headed. I didn't think about confronting her. Not yet. I didn't think about asking Regina why she said those things behind the half-closed door. I knew that if I asked now, I would only get the familiar explanations. And more importantly, I would lose the chance to see the whole story. A good auditor never rushes. He waits. He lets the numbers line themselves up. He lets the contradictions reveal themselves. I closed the notebook and put it in the drawer. I didn't want Regina or Justin to see it. Not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because I wasn't ready for the next step. As I stood up to turn off the light, I looked around the room once more. Everything looked the same. Nothing had changed on the outside, but inside me, a boundary had been drawn very clearly. From that night on, I no longer looked at my family through the eyes of someone who only wanted to believe. I began to look through the eyes of someone who was very familiar with the difference between words and reality. And I told myself one thing, very simply, very clearly. I would do nothing yet. I would not react. I would not conclude. I would only collect. Because when the truth is complete, it doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be placed in the right spot. After that night, I didn't change any of my habits. I still woke up early, made coffee, and read the newspaper at the kitchen table. I still asked Regina if she had slept well, still nodded when Justin talked about some important call coming up. On the surface, I was the same person as before, but inside, I had started looking at this house with different eyes. Things didn't begin with a major discovery. They began with very small, very ordinary things. Things I had never paid attention to before because I thought they weren't worth worrying about. One morning, as I tied up the trash bag to take it outside, I noticed a few folded papers inside that hadn't been torn up yet. I wasn't rummaging. One receipt was caught at the edge of the bag, exposing a corner, a bold printed number. I saw it for a split second before tying the bag shut. That afternoon, when I returned home, I opened the trash bag again. Not out of curiosity, but out of a reflex ingrained by decades in the profession. When a number doesn't add up, I don't ignore it just because it's uncomfortable. The receipt was from a restaurant I knew well, not a casual place. Somewhere you don't go just to eat until you're full. The amount was enough to cover a small family's living expenses for a week, spent on a single dinner. I folded the paper and set it aside. No comment, no conclusion. In the days that followed, I paid closer attention, not in a stalking way, but simply by noticing what had always been right there. Regina often said they were tightening their belts, but the refrigerator was never empty. Expensive organic foods kept appearing regularly. Bottled juices, specialty cheeses I used to buy only during the holidays. I didn't say anything. I just remembered. Another time I saw a bank envelope in the recycling bin. It had been lightly crumpled, as if whoever threw it away didn't want to look at it again. I picked it up and opened it. A late payment notice. The recipient was Regina, but not under her current last name. It was her maiden name from before she got married. I sat down at the kitchen table and held that envelope for a long time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't surprised. It was just a strange feeling, like realizing that someone you've known for years has been living a parallel life you never knew existed. a credit card under an old name, a small detail. But in the financial world, that's never random. It's a way to separate, to obscure, to blur the picture for anyone who isn't looking closely. Regina kept talking about difficulties. Justin kept talking about debts, about the bank pressing them. And at the same time, I saw packages being delivered to the front door. I saw new shoes. I saw rigid boxes with familiar logos, the same ones I had seen in other audits, in files that were anything but clean. The strange thing was that their payments were always late. There were always reminders, always notices, but I never once saw them truly struggling. No meals cut back, no utilities shut off, no real panic, just a steady stream of complaints, like a refrain repeated long enough for the listener to believe it was true. One afternoon, when both Regina and Justin were out, I heard the printer running in the shared office. I went in to turn it off. In the paper tray was an email that had just been printed. Justin must have forgotten to take it. I didn't intend to read it, but the subject line caught my eye before I could turn away. It was an email thread. Not long, but enough for me to recognize a tone completely different from what Justin showed me. Not someone in despair, but someone negotiating, buying time, figuring out how to maneuver. I folded the paper and placed it back on the desk, then turned off the printer. I didn't take it with me. I didn't confront anyone. I simply added another piece to the puzzle. That evening, sitting in my own study, I took out the black notebook again. I began to compile. Not with emotion, but in the way I knew best. The debts Justin talked about, the late notices, the actual spending. When I put everything on the same page, the numbers became very clear. The real total debt was higher than the figure they had given me in their story. Not shockingly higher, but enough to show that they had chosen to tell less than the truth. And then, more importantly, alongside those debts were other cash flows. Not large, not consistent, but real. Expenses that couldn't come from nothing. Small, scattered transactions, just enough to sustain a lifestyle that someone truly desperate couldn't afford. I looked at my notes and the feeling inside me began to change. Before, there had been pain, a vague ache, like realizing you might have raised your child the wrong way. But now, that pain was gradually replaced by something colder. I stopped asking why Regina was doing this. I stopped searching for a sympathetic explanation. I began to see things exactly as they were. No rose-colored lenses, no excuses. Poor wasn't their condition. It was a performance. A performance carefully rehearsed, repeated consistently, and used as a tool. And I, in my role as the father, was expected to be the easiest audience. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear. I sat quietly in the room, listening to the ordinary sounds upstairs. Regina laughing at her phone, Justin walking down the hallway. Everything sounded normal. But I knew that from this moment on, I would never hear those sounds the same way again. I closed the notebook, not because I was done, but because I knew I needed time. Time for more things to reveal themselves, time for the picture to become complete. What I felt then was no longer hurt. It had shifted into something else, more precise, more controlled. A feeling I had experienced many times when dealing with complex cases. The necessary coldness to see the truth clearly. I told myself quietly, like a reminder meant only for me. When the numbers don't add up, the problem isn't the numbers. The problem is the story being told around them. And I knew the story Regina and Justin were telling me was still missing many chapters. That night, after closing the black notebook and placing it back in the drawer, I didn't go to bed right away. The house was quieter than usual. Regina and Justin had gone to their room early, probably tired after a long day of worrying about the future. I stayed in the study a little longer, then slowly climbed the stairs to the attic. Up there was an old wooden cabinet, something I hadn't opened in years. It stood against the wall, slightly tilted because one leg was worn down. I pulled the door open, the hinge making a familiar soft creak. Inside were stacked brown paper boxes, each carefully labeled by me a long time ago. I took out a small box, lighter than I remembered. On the lid, my handwriting was still there. Regina, early years. I placed it on the table, sat down on the low wooden chair, and opened it. The smell of old paper drifted up, mixed with something hard to name. Inside were photo albums, leather covers worn at the corners. I turned the first page very slowly. Regina, at 3 years old, standing in the backyard, wearing an oversized red coat, arms spread wide as if she wanted to hug the whole world. I remembered that day. It was cold, but she insisted on going out to play in the snow. I stood behind the camera, laughing and worrying she might slip. Back then, my world had narrowed to that single frame. I turned the page. Regina at 5, hair in 2 braids, sitting on the front steps, holding a melting ice cream bar. That was the first summer after my wife died. I remembered how hard I worked not to cry while watching her eat, because I didn't want her to see my weakness. I promised myself that no matter what happened, Regina would not lack anything, would not feel less fortunate than other children. The years of raising her alone passed like days that felt both long and short. I learned to cook the simple meals she liked, learned which clothes needed to be hand-washed, learned to sit for hours by her bed when she had a fever, wiping her forehead and whispering stories without beginnings or endings. I worked during the day, came home at night, and gave every remaining moment to her. There were times I was exhausted. Nights when I sat alone in the kitchen, lights dimmed, wondering if I was doing enough. But then the next morning, Regina would run down the stairs and hug me tightly, and all my doubts would fade. I kept turning the pages. Regina on her first day of school. Regina in a performance dress at a school concert. Regina laughing, Regina crying, Regina growing up inside square frames. In every photo, I could see myself somewhere just outside the picture, even if I wasn't visible. The one holding the camera, the one driving the car, the one waiting. I had sacrificed a great deal, but I never called it sacrifice. To me, it was simply the responsibility of being a father. I didn't buy a new car when I could repair the old one. I didn't take long trips when I could save money for her tuition. I worked overtime, took on difficult audits, because I knew every dollar I saved today was one less worry for Regina tomorrow. When she went to college, I paid the full tuition. No loans, no debt hanging over her head. I wanted her to start adulthood with light hands. And when she graduated, standing on that stage, searching for me in the crowd, I thought all those years had been worth it. I closed the album for a moment and rested my hand on the worn leather cover. My chest felt heavy. Then I opened it again and turned to the final pages. Regina at 25, at a small backyard party. Standing next to Justin, arm in arm, smiling brightly. I remembered looking at them and thinking my daughter had found someone to lean on, so she wouldn't have to carry everything alone the way I once had. I believed that from then on my role would be lighter. I would be the father in the background, ready to help if needed, but no longer the sole pillar. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I set the album down, leaned back in the chair, and closed my eyes. The little girl in those early photos and the woman living under my roof now were no longer the same person. Not because of time, not because of growing up, but because the way she looked at me had changed. I was no longer her father in her eyes. I was something else. A role, an option. That realization hurt more than any loss I had ever experienced, because it felt like losing a child while she was still alive, still calling me dad, still sitting at the dinner table every night. But somewhere along the way, the bond between us had been replaced by numbers and calculations. I understood then that I was no longer seen as a father, at least not in the way I had believed. In the picture Regina and Justin were drawing, I wasn't the center of affection. I was a resource, something to be activated when needed, then put away when the job was done. That understanding didn't make me shout or slam the table. It made me quiet. A deep, heavy quiet, but very clear. I stopped searching for reasons to defend them. I stopped asking where I had gone wrong. There are choices that people will make no matter how you raise them. I placed the album back into the box and closed the lid carefully. When I stood up, my knees creaked softly, a reminder that I was no longer young. I carried the box back to the cabinet and closed the wooden door. Back in the study, I sat down at the desk and took a deep breath. Inside me, a decision was slowly taking shape. Not rushed, not impulsive, but certain. I would not continue playing the role of rescuer. I had done that my entire life, and I had done enough. Rescue only makes sense when the person being rescued wants to stand up on their own. When it becomes an automatic expectation, it is no longer help, it is self-harm. From that moment on, I began thinking about protecting myself, not through immediate confrontation, but through preparation. I had spent my life teaching my daughter how to live responsibly. Perhaps it was time to apply that lesson to myself. I turned off the light, left the study, and walked toward the bedroom. In the hallway, a nightlight glowed from Regina's room. I heard soft laughter, quiet conversation. I didn't stop. I kept walking. That night, I lay in bed for a long time. I didn't fall asleep right away. But inside me, for the first time in weeks, there was a clarity that felt almost cold. I knew I would not go back to being the blind father I had been before. And even though that realization hurt, I also knew it was necessary. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because of insomnia, but because my mind already held a clear list of things to do, as precise as any workday morning from years past. The feeling was so familiar that I almost smiled when I recognized it. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was acting according to a process. I called Margaret Lewis at 8:15 a.m. I had kept her number for many years, from back when we worked on a complex audit involving a pension fund. At the time, Margaret was the attorney representing the bank. We weren't close, but I knew she was careful and disliked ambiguity. She picked up after the second ring. "Leonard?" Her voice was low and decisive. "It's been a long time." "It has," I said. "I need to see you. It's a family matter. But I want to present it as a hypothetical situation." There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line. I knew Margaret understood what that meant. "This afternoon," she said. "My office, 3 p.m. Margaret's office was in an old brick building downtown. No flash, no large signage. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the waiting room, looking at the black and white photographs on the walls. Judges, courtrooms, stern faces marked by time. I had sat in rooms like this many times before, but this time was different. I wasn't there as a witness or an expert. I was there as someone who needed to protect himself. Margaret invited me into her office. She sat across from me, pen in hand, but didn't rush to take notes. "You said this is hypothetical," she began, "so tell me as if it has nothing to do with you." I nodded. I told her everything calmly, without embellishment, without emotional language. An elderly father, a daughter and son-in-law living in the same house, complaints about financial hardship, a large debt presented for him to assume, signs of spending that didn't match the narrative, conversations overheard by chance. I presented it like a case file, not like a family story. Margaret listened very carefully. She didn't interrupt. Occasionally, she nodded or asked a short question to clarify a detail. When I finished, she set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. "Leonard," she said slowly, "do you know what concerns me the most about what you just described?" I shook my head. Not the debt, she said, but the way it was presented. The use of phrases like family responsibility. You understand, Dad, in a situation where you are an older adult, living together and emotionally dependent on your children, those are classic indicators of elder financial exploitation. I straightened in my chair. Even though I had prepared myself, I still felt a chill run down my spine. Exploitation? I repeated. Margaret nodded. Legally speaking, when someone intentionally applies pressure, manipulates emotions, or withholds financial information to make a person over 60 assume debt or transfer assets, it's no longer just a family matter. It can be a violation of the law. I fell silent. In my mind, the pieces began fitting together in a different way. No longer personal pain, but the seriousness of what this actually was. You're fortunate, Margaret continued, that you haven't signed anything, and that you've started documenting. But if you want to proceed, there's one thing I need to make very clear. She looked directly at me. Everything must be done legally, cleanly, without emotion, no unilateral actions, no crossing lines. I nodded. That's exactly what I want. Margaret let out a small breath of relief. Good. Then the next step isn't confrontation, it's collection and verification, but that shouldn't be something you do alone. She wrote a name on a small piece of paper and slid it toward me. Ethan Brooks, she said, a financial investigator. I've worked with him on a few cases, very discreet, very principled, and most importantly, he operates strictly within the law. I took the paper. The name itself meant nothing to me, but Margaret's tone did. You can tell him I referred you, she added. And remember, Leonard, from this point on, you are no longer a father trying to understand his children. You are someone protecting his own assets and rights. I left Margaret's office with a very strange feeling. Not relief, but clarity. As if someone had turned on the lights in a dark room I had been feeling my way through for weeks. I met Ethan Brooks 2 days later at a small cafe near the river. Ethan was much younger than me, early 40s, dressed simply, spoke plainly. He listened as I explained everything, occasionally asking very specific, well-placed questions. You did the right thing, Ethan said after reviewing the documents I had gathered. But what you have right now are indicators. To turn this into a complete picture, we need to verify sources of funds, cash flows, and consistency in their statements. I don't want to do anything shady, I said. I don't want to invade anyone's privacy. Ethan nodded. Neither do I. We only work with what's legal. Public records, voluntarily provided documents, and anything that occurs within your own household. He looked at me seriously. If I take this on, you need to accept one thing. The results may not be pleasant. The truth is, sometimes worse than what we imagine. I didn't hesitate. I'm prepared. Ethan accepted the file, flipped through a few pages, then closed it. All right, he said. I'll begin. But from this point on, you don't do anything else. No questions, no probing, no testing. You live as usual. I understood. That was the only way to keep everything from being compromised. In the days that followed, I returned to my familiar routine. Regina and Justin didn't notice any change. I was still the quiet father, not curious, not questioning. But behind the scenes, something had begun to take shape. My file was no longer just scattered notes in a black notebook. It was slowly becoming a structured case, with responsibility assigned and a clear direction. Like a real investigation. And most importantly, I was no longer in a passive position. I wasn't waiting for them to tell the truth or hoping things would fix themselves. I had chosen to protect myself, not with anger, but with the law. For the first time since all of this began, I felt like I was no longer backed into a corner. I was standing upright, and I knew that whatever the outcome, I would face it that way. I began preparing my gift on a very quiet evening, just a few days before Christmas. The house was filled with familiar holiday details. The faint scent of cinnamon from the candle Regina liked to burn, warm yellow lights blinking around the window frames, Christmas music playing softly from the living room speaker. Everything looked warm and familiar, almost mockingly so. I sat alone in my study, the door slightly ajar, like many nights before. But this time, the desk held more than just the black notebook. In front of me was a neatly organized stack of documents, so orderly that if someone walked in, they might think I was preparing for a professional presentation rather than a family confrontation. I wasn't in a hurry. I had never rushed important things. The gift box I chose wasn't large, elegant in appearance, deep red with thin gold trim. The kind of box people use for something valuable, enough to suggest importance without being showy. I bought it at a small, familiar shop where the clerk asked me with a friendly smile, "A gift for family?" I nodded. Very close family. Inside that box, there was no cash, no checks, nothing Regina or Justin could convert into material value. What I placed inside was the truth, the one thing they had never prepared themselves to receive. I started with the financial reports Ethan had verified. Nothing sensational, no harsh language, just numbers, clear annotations, comparisons between what they said and the reality of the cash flows. I placed them at the bottom of the box because they were the foundation of everything. The truth always belongs at the lowest, firmest level. On top of that were the legal notices Margaret had prepared. Not a lawsuit, not accusations, just documents outlining rights, obligations, and boundaries. They made it clear that I understood where I stood and that I was no longer in the fog they assumed I was. I marked each page with small tabs so that if anyone chose to read, they couldn't skip the important parts. Finally, on top, I placed a short summary, one I wrote myself, not in the voice of a scolding father, not in the dry tone of an auditor, but in the voice of someone who had seen the entire picture clearly and no longer needed to argue. I didn't use phrases like, "You've disappointed me." I didn't ask, "Why would you do this to me?" I wrote only what was true and what would happen next. No threats, no excess emotion, just the logical consequences of choices made. When everything was arranged, I looked at the box for a long time. Not with anger, but with a strange feeling, like closing a file that had followed you for years. No lingering questions, no unfinished business, just completion. There was a very clear irony in all of this, and I didn't deny it. But it was controlled irony, not born of rage but of clarity. They had chosen Christmas to give me their gift. I was simply responding in kind. I chose the timing not to shock, but to make avoidance impossible. Christmas is when people expect unity, forgiveness, softness. And precisely because of that, it's when performances are easiest to expose. When everything is decorated to look perfect, the raw truth stands out even more clearly. I didn't tell Regina or Justin what I was preparing. I didn't hint. I didn't allude. I still ate dinner with them, still listened as they talked about plans after the new year, about when things get better. I just listened, storing every word as part of the final picture. I placed the gift box in the cabinet in my study, behind old files. I didn't open it again. I didn't revise anything. Everything was already enough. And once something is enough, touching it again only disturbs the original clarity. The days leading up to Christmas passed slowly, but not heavily. Strangely, I felt calmer than ever. Not because I was anticipating the moment they opened the box, but because I was no longer suspended in uncertainty. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew why I was doing it. And I knew that whatever the outcome, it would not leave me unmoored. I didn't set a trap. I simply let them walk into what they themselves had built over a long time. Words, choices, calculations, all of it led to this moment. I merely stood still, not blocking, not interfering. My calm didn't come from controlling others. It came from taking control of myself. And when you see the entire picture clearly, you no longer need to speak much. You simply place the truth on the table, at the right moment, in the right place, and let it do the rest. Regina was the one who opened the gift box. She did it with a slightly stiff smile, the kind people wear when they believe they're about to receive what they already expect. That Christmas, the living room was bright with lights, the tree in the corner more carefully decorated than in years past. Justin sat beside her, leaning back in his chair, holding a cup of steaming coffee. They both looked like they were waiting for a familiar ritual. The aging father finally doing what they believed was inevitable. Regina untied the red ribbon carefully, as if she didn't want to damage the appearance of the gift. When the lid came off, there was no cheer, no quick thank you. Just a brief, very brief moment when her eyes froze. Inside was paper, not envelopes of cash, not the contract she hoped I would sign, just neatly arranged stacks of documents, aligned straight, as if someone had taken great care to put them in their proper place. Regina frowned. She lifted the first page. The air in the room shifted, subtly, but enough for me to feel it. Justin leaned in to look into the box, still casual at first. Page after page turned in silence. No one spoke. Only the soft sound of paper brushing against paper, clear enough that I noticed Regina's hands were shaking. Not from cold, but because the words on those pages were becoming familiar in a way she had never expected. Justin reacted first. I saw the moment clearly, even without looking directly at him. His breathing changed, his shoulders tightened, his expression moved from curiosity to focus, then to confusion. "Wait," Justin said, his voice slightly higher than usual. He took a stack of papers from Regina's hands and flipped through them faster. Too fast, as if searching for something specific, a familiar number. And then he found it. I watched Justin's face drain of color. Not dramatic shock, but the very real panic of someone realizing that what he tried to hide had been laid out neatly, completely, without a single line missing. "This," Justin began, then stopped. He swallowed. "Where did this come from?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence do its work. Regina looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and something like pleading, but without words. "Why do you have these?" she asked. Her voice was much quieter than it had been when she handed me her gift that morning. I set my coffee cup down on the table, slowly. No rush. There was no need anymore. "There's something I think you both need to understand," I said. My voice was steady, neither raised nor low. "There's a difference between an investigation and an audit." Justin looked up, his eyes sharpening for a brief moment as if trying to grasp a thin thread of hope. "An investigation," I continued, "is when you suspect someone and try to prove they're wrong. An audit is different. An audit is when you already have the data and you simply confirm the full picture it shows." Regina stiffened. I could see it clearly. She understood, not everything, but enough to know she was no longer in control of the narrative. "I don't need to suspect," I said. "You left enough traces." Justin half stood, then sat back down. He picked up a sheet of paper, his hands visibly shaking. I saw the number he was staring at, a number he thought only he and the bank knew. "Dad, did you spy on us?" Justin asked, his voice sharp with fear more than anger. "No," I replied. I looked. I leaned forward slightly, enough to make my presence felt without invading their space. "I looked at what you exposed. Forgotten bills, half-printed emails, spending that didn't match the story you told. And when things don't match, I do what I've done for over 40 years. I paused. I audit." The room went completely still. The Christmas tree lights continued to blink, creating a strange contrast with the thickening air. Regina flipped through a few more pages, this time more slowly, as if each line were a blade cutting into the confidence she'd brought into the room that morning. "You know everything," she whispered. Not a question, an admission. I didn't nod, I didn't deny it. I simply placed another stack of papers on the table, separate from the gift box. "This," I said, "is the eviction notice." Justin jerked his head up. Regina froze. 90 days, I continued, my voice steady. "In full compliance with the law, not earlier, not later. Enough time for you to make arrangements." Regina burst into tears. This time I knew it wasn't an act anymore. Not tears meant to apply pressure or draw sympathy. This was the kind of crying that comes when the last curtain has been pulled away, when there's no longer any way to negotiate with emotion. "You can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "This is my home." I looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not cold, just looking. "No," I said. "This is my home, and I shared it with you, for 3 years." Justin opened his mouth as if to say something, then stopped. He looked at the pile of documents in front of him. The numbers, the notes, the verification marks. I could see the truth settling in his eyes. There was no way out through words anymore. The room sank into a heavy silence. Not the silence of anger, but the silence of truth once it has been spoken, bare, with nowhere left to hide. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I didn't need to. The truth had enough weight to stand on its own. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said slowly. "I'm doing it because I can't keep pretending I don't know anymore." Regina sobbed. Justin lowered his head, both hands gripping his forehead. No one said anything else. And I didn't need them to. The mask had fallen. Not with a violent pull, but under the weight of everything they had built over the past 3 years. I sat there, in a room glowing with Christmas lights, and for the first time, I no longer felt like I was standing in front of my daughter and son-in-law. I was standing in front of the truth. And I knew that from that moment on, no one in that room could pretend nothing had happened. The atmosphere in the room after that moment no longer felt like Christmas morning. It felt like a boardroom after a decision had been made, when everyone understands that negotiations are over. Justin was the first to break the silence. He jumped to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this," he said, his voice hard, no longer trying to stay polite. "You invaded our privacy. You collected information illegally. We can sue you." Regina looked up, her tears not yet dry, but a thin thread of hope flashed in her eyes. "That's right," she said quickly, clinging to it. "You don't have the right to do this. You're family. You're not the police. You're not a court." I stayed seated. I had expected this reaction. When the truth can't be denied, people often switch to attack to regain a sense of control. "If you think you've won," Justin continued, "you're wrong. We'll hire a lawyer. We'll counter-sue for invasion of privacy, for emotional distress." I looked straight at him, not challenging, not mocking, just calm. "You have the right to do that," I said. "Just as I have the right to protect myself." Justin scoffed, but the sound was hollow. Regina turned to him as if searching for reassurance. I let them talk. I didn't interrupt, because I knew there were answers that didn't need to come from me. The doorbell rang at exactly that moment. Not loud, not frantic, but clear enough to make them both flinch. Regina turned toward the door, then back to me, suspicion filling her eyes. "Did you invite someone else?" she asked. I stood up, adjusted my sleeve, and walked to the door. Margaret Lewis stood there, wearing a dark coat, a briefcase in her hand. She looked at me, gave a slight nod, and stepped inside as if she were already familiar with the space. "Good morning," she said calmly. "I hope I'm not too early." Justin froze. Regina shot to her feet. "Who are you?" Regina asked, her voice unsteady. "I'm Mr. Leonard's attorney," Margaret replied crisply, "and I was invited here to address exactly what you were just talking about." Justin opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked from me to Margaret, as if trying to piece together a picture that had just collapsed. "You mentioned countersuing," Margaret continued, opening her briefcase and pulling out a folder. "We can start there." She placed the file on the table, not forcefully, but firmly. "First," she said, "all documents Mr. Leonard used were obtained legally. Anything left in the common areas of a house he owns is not considered an invasion. Anything provided to a financial investigator was done with the property owner's consent." Justin stepped back. Regina shook her head, muttering something I couldn't hear. "Second," Margaret went on, "the eviction notice was issued properly within the required time frame. There is no element of threat, coercion, or retaliation." She looked directly at Justin. "And third," she said, her voice cooling, "if you want to talk about violations, then we should discuss the concealment of financial information to pressure a person over 60 into assuming debt. That has a very clear legal definition." The room went so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking. Regina's face drained of color. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Margaret replied, "that if this matter were brought before a court, the party at a disadvantage would not be Mr. Leonard." Justin started to protest, but Margaret didn't give him the chance. "The file Mr. Leonard provided," she said, "has already been forwarded to the tax authorities to verify undeclared income and assets. That isn't punishment. It's a legal obligation when there are signs of non-transparency." Regina let out a dry, choking sound. "The tax authorities?" I gave a small nod. Not to threaten, just to confirm. "That's impossible," Justin said, his voice breaking. "We haven't done anything that serious." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "That isn't for me to decide. Or for Mr. Leonard. That will be determined by the review." Justin collapsed back into the chair, both hands clutching his head. I saw sweat forming on his forehead, even though the room wasn't warm. Less than an hour later, Regina's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then started trembling. "My card," she said softly. It was declined. Justin pulled out his phone, tapping frantically. His face went from pale to gray. Mine too. Margaret didn't look surprised. "When a file is opened," she said, "financial institutions often temporarily freeze accounts to assess risk. That's standard procedure." Regina broke down completely this time, real panic setting in. "Dad," she said, turning to me, her voice shattered. "Please, can you undo this? Just tell them it's a misunderstanding. I'm begging you." Justin stepped toward me as well. "We'll move out sooner," he said quickly. "This week, we'll figure something else out. Just make it stop." I looked at them for a long time. I saw no calculation left in their eyes, only fear, but it was fear that came too late. "I'm not changing my decision," I said evenly. "Not because I'm angry, but because I can't go back to closing my eyes." "But your family," Regina sobbed. "Family is supposed to help each other." I nodded slowly. "Yes, family helps when there's honesty, not when people use each other as an escape." Justin shook his head over and over. "We can work something out. We'll pay it back. We'll sign papers. Anything." I stood up and looked straight at both of them. "There's no room for compromise anymore," I said. "You chose your path, and I've chosen mine." Margaret gathered her files and nodded to me. "If you need to communicate further," she said to Regina and Justin, "please do so through counsel. From now on, everything should go through proper channels." The door closed behind Margaret. The room felt strangely empty. Regina slumped into the chair, her face buried in her hands. Justin stood motionless, as if all strength had drained out of him. I looked at them, feeling no sense of victory or defeat. just the end of a chapter I had tried to hold together for far too long. Every exit had been cut off, not by me, but by the choices they had made, little by little over the past 3 years. And for the first time, I no longer felt responsible for carrying the consequences for anyone else. The days that followed in the house passed heavily, but in a very different way. There was no more forced laughter, no more roundabout stories about opportunities coming soon, or just needing a bit more time. The atmosphere was like a house after a storm. Everything still there, but nothing quite in its old place. Regina and Justin barely left their room. When they came down to the kitchen, their steps were so quiet they almost felt apologetic. I kept to my usual routine, brewing coffee in the morning, reading the paper, watering the plants outside. Not to appear indifferent, but because I didn't want to turn the house into an emotional battleground. I was too old to shout and too clear-headed to play the role of a victor. The tension didn't explode into a dramatic argument. It settled into fragmented conversations, avoided glances, doors closing a little harder than necessary. It was the kind of tension that wears you down, slow, steady, exhausting. 3 days after Christmas, Regina was the one who asked to talk. She stood in the doorway of my study, one hand on the frame, neither stepping in nor walking away. I knew this moment would come. I just didn't know how. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, no longer sharp or confident. I nodded and gestured to the chair across from me. Regina sat down, her hands tightly clasped together, as if letting go would cause everything to fall apart. "You know," she said after a moment of silence, "I never thought you could do something like this." "So cruel," she continued, lifting her eyes to meet mine this time. "You're my father." I listened without interrupting. I let the words pass through me, settle, and only then did I speak. "You call it cruelty," I said. "I call it boundaries." Regina shook her head, her eyes red. "You've backed us into a corner. Don't you see that?" I exhaled slowly. "No, Regina. I didn't push you anywhere. You walked there a long time ago. I just stopped catching you." She gave a bitter laugh. "So you admit it. You could help, but you chose not to." I leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk slowly. "No," I said. "I chose not to enable." Regina frowned. "What's the difference?" I looked at her for a long time. Not to convince her, but to make sure I was saying this to the person who needed to hear it. "Forgiveness," I said, "is when someone makes a mistake, acknowledges it, and wants to fix it. Enabling is when someone repeats the mistake, hides it, and expects someone else to bear the consequences." She was about to argue, but I raised my hand, not high, not harsh, just enough to ask for one more moment. "If you had come to me 3 years ago," I said, "and told me you'd overspent, that Justin was struggling, that you needed help, I would have sat down with you. I would have run the numbers. I would have looked for solutions. I would have helped." My voice didn't shake, but my throat tightened. "But you didn't do that," I continued. "You chose a different path. You chose to lie, to hide, to turn me into a last resort without giving me the right to know the truth." Regina lowered her head. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry out loud. "I was scared," she said softly. "I was afraid that if I told the truth, you'd be disappointed." I nodded. "I would have been disappointed. Yes, but I would still have been your father." I paused, making sure the next sentence didn't get swallowed by emotion. "But now," I said, "I'm not just disappointed. I'm forced to protect myself." She looked up, her eyes filled with anger and pain. "You chose money over me." The words landed in the room like a heavy object. I felt them, but I didn't step back. "No," I said, "I chose integrity." Regina looked at me as if I'd said something completely foreign. Integrity? Yes, I replied. The integrity of a person who can't keep looking away while being taken advantage of, who can't teach himself that family excuses dishonesty. I leaned back in my chair. A family can't be built on lies, Regina. It can exist for a while, but it will rot from the inside. She stood up abruptly. So that's it, she said, her voice shaking but firm. You're willing to lose your daughter just to protect what you call your principles. I stood up as well, not to confront her, but to meet her at eye level. No, I said, I'm willing to lose the illusion that I could save you by sacrificing myself. The distance between us in that moment wasn't a few steps across the room. It was a deep chasm we both saw clearly, and both knew no one could bridge for the other. Regina looked at me one more time. In her eyes, I saw anger, hurt, and a deep, quiet fear, the fear of having to face the consequences of her own choices. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said. I nodded. I understand. She turned away, walked out of the room, and closed the door. This time it didn't slam, but the sound was final. In the days that followed, silence settled over the house. No late-night conversations in the kitchen, no music, no attempts at reconciliation. Each of us lived in our own space, like planets drifting on separate orbits. I accepted it, not easily, but necessarily. There were nights when I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about the little girl in the old photographs, about the promises I had whispered at my wife's hospital bed. I wondered whether I had failed as a father. Then I asked myself another question, one that was far clearer. If I went back, closed my eyes, signed the papers, took on the debt, and kept living in lies, what would I be teaching my child? The answer left me silent for a long time, but it also steadied me. The silence in the house stretched on, heavy but not chaotic. It was the quiet that follows a truth that has been spoken and can't be taken back. And painful as it was, I knew I had chosen correctly. Not because I wanted to win, but because I didn't want to lose myself. They moved out earlier than the 90 days I had clearly stated in the notice, not because everything had been neatly arranged, but because staying any longer had become mental torture for all three of us. I understood that. And somewhere deep inside, I was relieved I wouldn't have to wait until the last minute. That morning, I woke before the sky fully lightened. Winter slowed everything down. Pale gray light slipped through the curtains, covering the room in stillness. I brewed coffee as usual, but this time I didn't take the mug to the kitchen table. I stood at the window of my study, looking down at the driveway. The rental truck had been parked out front since early morning. Justin carried things out first. He worked fast, sharp, almost rough. Cardboard boxes were hauled out and stacked in the truck without any clear order. I recognized a few with logos from stores whose receipts I had seen in the trash, items bought with money they said they didn't have. Regina appeared a little later. She wore a heavy coat, her hair neatly tied back. Her face looked far more hollow than before. No makeup, no jewelry. A completely different image from the woman who used to come down the stairs every morning with confidence, certain everything was still under her control. I stood behind the window frame, neither hiding nor making myself visible on purpose. I didn't want to make this goodbye heavier, but I wasn't going to disappear either. Regina carried a small box to the truck, then stopped in the middle of the yard. She stood there for a few seconds, looking at the house she had lived in for 3 years, the house she had called my home, without ever asking how I felt. She looked up. Our eyes met through the glass. Not for long, just long enough for both of us to know the other was looking. There was no wave, no nod, no goodbye. Justin called her, his voice urgent. Regina turned away. No apology was spoken. Not because there was no opportunity, but because some apologies, when they come too late, are no longer about healing, only about easing the speaker's guilt. There was no farewell hug either. I didn't expect one. A hug at that moment would have been purely symbolic, and I was too tired of symbols. The truck's rear door closed. Justin climbed into the driver's seat. Regina took the passenger seat. The engine started. The truck rolled slowly down the driveway, then turned off the street I had lived on for more than half my life. I stood there long after the truck disappeared, not because I hoped they would come back, but because I needed to let the moment pass fully, without avoiding it, without cutting it short. When I finally turned away, the house felt suddenly very quiet. Not the strained quiet of the days before, but an empty, deep, honest quiet. I walked through each room, the living room where the conversations had taken place, the dining room where they had once sat across from me with the debt papers, the staircase where I had stood frozen the first time I overheard that phone call. Their old bedroom was empty, a few scratches on the floor from moving furniture, a forgotten coat hook behind the door. I didn't touch it right away, I just stood there. That afternoon, I went into my study and opened the drawer where I had kept the stack of debt papers they brought on Christmas morning. Those pages had never truly held legal weight for me. I hadn't signed them, but I had kept them as a reminder. I took them out, stacked them neatly, and fed them into the shredder. The machine hummed steadily, neither fast nor slow. Sheet by sheet turned into thin strips. I didn't do it in anger. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I didn't want to carry that burden into the next chapter of my life, even on paper. When the machine stopped, I stood looking at the bin filled with shredded pieces. Something inside me had just been cut loose as well. The house was empty but not cold. I opened the windows and let fresh air move through. Late afternoon light spread across the wooden floors, revealing the spaces where their furniture had been. Empty but clean. There was sadness, of course. The kind of sadness a father feels when he realizes the relationship he protected for decades no longer exists as he believed. Sadness for the little girl in the photo albums who would never return in the same way. But I had no regrets. I sat down in the armchair in the living room, where I had spent many evenings alone after my wife passed away. The familiar feeling returned, not comforting, but known. I thought about all the choices that had brought me to that day, some painful but necessary, some costs no one else could pay for me. I knew that from that moment on, that chapter of my life was closed, not with a slammed door, but with a long silence. Enough to understand that not every story gets a gentle ending. That evening, I locked the house earlier than usual. The click of the lock sounded louder than I expected, like a period at the end of a sentence. Relief didn't come immediately. It wasn't a rush or a release. It came slowly, like warmth spreading through a room after the heater turns on. I stood in the kitchen, washed a single mug, and placed it on the rack. Just one, not three. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I was breathing naturally, without bracing myself, without needing to endure or explain anything to anyone. I had closed a chapter of my life, not with bitterness, but with clarity. And even though the sadness was still there, I knew I had walked out of that story with my integrity intact. The weeks that followed passed more quietly than I expected. No more conversations, no late messages. The house remained calm, as if adjusting its breathing after a long period of tension. One morning in early January, I received a letter from the tax authorities. Not a summons, not an accusation. Just an official notice that files related to undeclared income and assets had been opened for review. The language was formal, neutral, no emotion, no judgment. I read it carefully, folded it, and placed it in an envelope with the other documents Margaret and Ethan had helped me prepare. I felt no satisfaction, no anxiety, just a clear sense that what needed to happen had finally reached the right place. That afternoon, I opened my computer and created a new folder. I named it Closed. I dragged all the related materials into it. Reports, notes, emails, copies of legal notices. I didn't delete them. I didn't deny they had existed. But I no longer needed to open them every day. When the folder closed, I realized something simple I had never allowed myself to think before. Not everything needs to be resolved by holding on. Some things truly end only when you set them down. That New Year's Eve, I was alone. No parties, no laughter, no raised glasses out of family obligation. I cooked a simple meal, just enough for one person. I played soft music, not holiday music, just a familiar tune I'd listened to since I was young. As the clock approached 12 a.m., I stood by the window. Fireworks burst in the distance, bright but quiet inside my room. Light reflected on the glass, blurred, then faded. I didn't feel lonely. I felt at peace. For the first time in a long while, I didn't need to prepare answers for anyone. I didn't need to worry about disappointing someone with my decisions. I didn't need to ask myself whether I had given enough. I thought about the years behind me, about being a father, a husband, a provider. I had once believed love meant endurance, that sacrifice was the only measure of responsibility. But standing at the threshold of a new year, I understood something else. Protecting yourself is not selfish. It's the boundary that keeps a person from being worn down until they lose themselves. When you allow others to cross every line, you're not loving them. You're teaching them that honesty no longer matters. I no longer resent Regina. Resentment takes too much energy, and I don't want to spend what remains of my life on it. I don't turn myself into a victim either. I simply see things as they happened. No exaggeration, no minimization. Some relationships don't break because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of boundaries. Some families don't fall apart because of poverty, but because prolonged ambiguity is hidden behind the words, "for us." If there's one thing I want to keep from everything that happened, it isn't pain, it's the lesson. Financial boundaries within a family don't weaken bonds. On the contrary, they help each person understand responsibility and prevent love from becoming a tool of pressure. Transparency isn't coldness. It's the only way adults can face the consequences of the choices they make. And above all, no one should be forced to choose between their integrity and their family. When that happens, the problem isn't the person making the choice, but the way the relationship drifted from its foundation. I want to be clear about one thing. This story is fictional. It was created not to incite hatred, nor to criticize or harm any individual, family, or organization. It was written to share a perspective that in complicated family situations, everyone has the right to set boundaries to protect themselves, calmly and legally. If you've made it this far, you may have experienced or be facing difficult choices of your own. You may have wondered whether you're being too hard. I don't have the right answer for everyone. I only have my experience. And that experience taught me that peace doesn't come from pleasing everyone, but from not betraying yourself. I closed the curtains, turned off the living room lights, and went to bed that New Year's Eve with a genuine sense of relief. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had chosen a path I could keep walking, head held high, without looking back. If you're watching this story, I'd truly like to know, where are you watching from in the world? And if you were in my place, what would you choose? Silent endurance or setting boundaries? Thank you for staying with me to the very end. Your presence, your thoughts, and your reflections are what make this story feel less alone. If this story brought you value or made you reflect, please gently tap like, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next story. I'm truly grateful to you.